Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Redeemer University College, and welcome to our lecture this evening on Which Side Are You On? Christianity and Labor in an Age of Inequality. My name is Rob Joustra, and I'm the founding director of the Center for Christian Scholarship here at Redeemer. The center created the award whose recipient we're honoring this evening, the Emerging Public Intellectual Award, to recognize and learn from the outstanding early career achievements of exceptional scholars whose work showed clear evidence of being civically minded for the common good and rooted in the person and the work of Jesus Christ, deeply Christian. The award is funded and adjudicated by the Center for Public Justice in Washington, Cardis, the CCCU, the Henry Institute at Calvin College, and the Acton Institute. This evening, we're especially grateful to the Christian Labour Association of Canada for sponsoring our evening together, and for Ian Dewart, their Ontario director, who joins us in a responding address. We get outstanding applications every single year, and let me tell you what the committee is looking for. A Christian faith that cannot fail to bubble over into all the areas of an applicant's life and work. We do not need to hunt for it. We do not need to guess at how they might think about their faith and their scholarship. It is constantly ever present. Second, and that their scholarship itself is of such a high caliber, of such significant weight, that they have begun to develop important teaching and writing deserving of a wide audience. They have not simply published a lot, they have produced works that the committee believes are of enduring substance. And that work and that spirituality is contagious. Calvin Seerveld liked to say, you cannot teach wisdom, but you can catch it. It's contagious, and their work shows evidence of having burst the very modest boundaries of academic life or even the Christian world, and it regularly rubs shoulders with neighbors, writers, and new friends, both in the Christian world and outside of it. They are the people that we want to hear from, we want to learn from, and the people that we want to support here at Redeemer. And so I am delighted to introduce one of our sponsors for this award, Mr. Brian Dykema, Program Director and Editor with Cardis, to present this year's Emerging Public Intellectual Award. Mr. Dykema.
Glad to see everybody. Thank you very much, Rob, for that introduction, and thanks very much, everyone, for being here tonight. It's an absolute pleasure for me, personally, professionally, to present the Center for Christian Scholarship's Emerging Public Intellectual Award this evening. But before I hand over the award, I'd like to abuse my place at the mic. As you know, anyone who knows me knows that happens every time I get behind a mic. And I'm going to ask you to indulge me or maybe even join me in a walk down a lane of my memory, which is a dangerous place to walk. I'm going to show you, it has a destination though. I was preparing for tonight and I was thinking to myself, how did I first meet Dr. Carter? How did I meet this guy who I'm giving the award to this evening? I'd love to be able to say that, you know, the two of us met on the shop floor somewhere and we shook calloused hands and we looked deep into each other's manly eyes and said, "It's good to see you, brother." But that was not at all the case. It was a slightly more literary way that we met. I came to know Dr. Carter through the literary grapevine through a close friend of mine who said that I should be keeping my eyes open for a young scholar who's doing very, very good work looking at Christians and labor in North America, and the labor movement in particular. One of my jobs at Cardis is to serve as an editor on the magazine Comment, and we have, I think, at least one former editor, Gideon Strauss, here. It's an honor to work in his footsteps. And Comment is a magazine that attempts to go beyond making the case for Christian engagement in the world. We assume that to be our calling, something that we don't have a choice of doing. We attempt instead to serve our readers by looking at how we get down to the difficult work of being faithfully present in the areas of culture in which we are placed. My other job at Cardis is to serve as program director for a research and policy program on work and economics. And one of my key files there is on organized labor. It's at the very center of my work. So the knowledge that there was a young scholar about to publish a book on Christianity and organized labor had a professional effect that was not dissimilar to dumping a 2-pound bag of catnip in front of your neighbor's maybe partially sane Persian. And to be quite frank, when I read the book, this book, Union Made, which you can buy over there, Heath's children and their college fund will thank you. The book didn't disappoint. It went straight to my head in a good way. So I want to note that while Heath's work extends beyond this book, the quality of work here captures the essence of why he's so deserving of the award this evening. I was a student here at Redeemer, and I had the honor, the pleasure of taking courses with Jim Payton. And he's a professor of history emeritus here at RUC. And he once quipped in a history class that whether we're historians, garbage collectors, whether we're parents, mothers, or fathers, wherever we are called to love our historical neighbors. And you might be asking yourself, how is it that you do that? How can you love somebody whom you've never met, who exists in the distant past? And I think it is one of the key tasks of a historian to introduce those historical neighbors to the present. One of their jobs is to act as a sort of footman who admits and announces strangers into our living rooms so that we can get to know them. It's an act of service. It's not always true that to know someone is to love them. I'm sure you know some people you don't love. But it is absolutely true that it is impossible to love somebody whom you don't know. And I think to do this job well as a historian requires a certain commitment to seeing these historical figures as more than just representatives of trend X or social theory Y. The best historians, the ones whose work starts conversations as much or more than finishing them, do this by digging deep into archives, letters, public records, and other sources to introduce the reader to real people and the various pressures, loves, institutions, beliefs, and relationships which shaped them, and which in turn shape us and our present day. This doesn't, of course, prevent you from having opinions about those people, or about any of those things, or of finding patterns, or yes, of finding how these things fit with various social theories. It doesn't even prevent you from disagreeing vehemently with the people that you read. But these things can only come after the hard work of a historian is done. Heath Carter's work and his oeuvre, Union Made, does that work particularly well. This book here is a fine piece of archaeology, full of exhaustive archival research on the mixture of Christian faith, churches, capital, and labor in Chicago and North America at the corner of the 19th and 20th centuries. His uncovering of a trove of stories, letters, articles, including translations of Chicago's vast foreign language literature. How much Polish did you actually read? Not enough. I think that's a huge accomplishment in itself. And it's a gift to everyone who's interested in American history and North American history. And it's a huge gift to those who have a keen interest in the role that Christianity played in North American social and economic history and in the history of the labor movement in this continent. So I'm somebody who now works in that field and is attempting to shape it in various ways according to my deepest beliefs. And I have to say that as I go about that work in public life today, that I'm extremely grateful for the work that Heath has done to introduce me to those historical people. So ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Carter's scholarship embodies this commitment to love one's historical neighbor. He does it in his academic life, and having had the pleasure of engaging with him personally and professionally over the last little while, it is clear that he is committed to love his neighbor not just on the pages of academic journals or in textbooks, but in his teaching and his wide and active engagement with the public square. So I'd therefore like to invite you to join me in giving an enthusiastic round of applause to this year's recipient of the Emerging Public Intellectual Award, Dr. Heath Carter.
Thank you so much. Just turn and take a picture here. Thank you. You good? Okay. Thank you. I want you to sign my book. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Brian, both for the kind comments, but also for that, I think, stirring sort of discussion of why history matters. I really do believe that, that there are good Christian reasons to care about history, and it is a way of discovering and loving neighbors, and of finding oneself in our current moment as well. So I appreciate that, and I hope you'll indulge me tonight as I introduce you to people that you've probably never heard of before. This is a kind of history that brings in neighbors that you likely don't know. But before I dive in, I do just want to add my thanks to Rob Joustra and Matt Van Amerongen and the whole Redeemer University College community that has been such a lovely host for this day. What a great day it's been. And thank you for having me here. Thank you to all of the sponsors of the Emerging Public Intellectual Award, to Cardis, the Center for Public Justice, the Acton Institute, the CCCU, the Henry Institute, and of course, Redeemer. And thanks too to the CLAC, which has sponsored this evening's keynote address. I'm really excited about the conversation to follow with Ian Dewart and my friend Brian Dykema. I hope that they will bring in even more of the Canadian perspective. You'll have to forgive me as an American. I'm a little provincial. The book is a lot about the United States, but I look forward to the conversation and thinking a little bit about those Canadian parallels and the comparison and the contrast. And I was very happy to be able to use the you for the first time ever. First time ever that I've used the you in labor here tonight. So it is a special night in so many different ways, and that is one of them. All right, well, without further ado, we are living in an age of historic inequality. In describing the contours of this new Gilded Age, scholars tend to emphasize the big picture, marshaling statistics to underscore the daunting scope of contemporary income and wealth disparities. And these figures certainly have their place. It is eye-opening, as you can see here on this chart, that the top 1% of American earners now command fully 22% of all income, numbers not seen since the years leading up to the Great Depression. And in my view, it's nothing short of astounding that as of 2017, the wealthiest Americans, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, and Warren Buffett, those three men, own more wealth than the entire bottom half of the American population combined, a total of 160 million people, or 63 million households. But numbers, no matter how impressive, don't capture the changing texture of life on the ground. Most people experience our age of inequality in far more intimate ways, as they navigate rapidly evolving conditions in their neighborhoods, their churches, their schools. You could all share stories from where you live. I'm going to talk just very briefly, if you'll indulge me, about where I live. Valparaiso, Indiana, a very small Midwestern city that some 35,000 people, myself included, call home. Class differentiation is anything but new in Valpo, and you can see it here in this photograph with that very large house in the foreground. The city sits some 50 miles southeast of downtown Chicago, long been home to a handful of very wealthy business magnates, a sizable professional middle class, and a great variety of ordinary workers. The oldest neighborhood in town, this picture is from it, includes an eclectic mix of Victorian mansions, early 20th century brick and frame multi-story homes, and a lot of exceedingly modest mid-century cottages. But in recent years, these long-standing class divides have expanded into something approaching a chasm. A revitalized downtown, complete with an array of upscale local businesses, spas, boutiques, cafes, microbreweries, wine shops, and even a meadery, has transformed Valpo into a fashionable bedroom community for Chicago executives willing to pay up to $500,000 for luxury condominiums and townhomes, a price that would have been unimaginable even just 10 or 15 years ago. Meanwhile, nearly half of the town's residents are struggling to pay their bills. One study from last year found that fully 43% of Valpo's households are not making the survival budget for our corner of Northwest Indiana. which is $59,544 American dollars for a family with 2 adults and 2 small children. Surging precarity is palpable across my community. You could find it lurking in school cafeterias, where the number of children who qualify for free lunch has increased by nearly 50% in the last decade. You can find it in church fellowship halls, a number of which double every night, especially during these winter months, as shelters for dozens of homeless men seeking a safe and warm place to sleep. Now, one common response to such worries is, okay, but this is all relative. There may be a widening gap between rich and poor in the United States, but even the poor here are rich by global standards. And there may be something to this idea. But we shouldn't underestimate the existence of real, and in some cases, downright lethal suffering right here in our very midst. Did you know that in many cities across the continent, the census tract you're born into can mean the difference of a decade or more in terms of your life expectancy? Let's see if I can get this. There we go. You aren't going to be able to see this especially well, but the basic story is that, for example, on New York's Upper East Side, the average resident lives until 85. But in Brownsville, a poor black neighborhood just 10 miles away in Brooklyn, life expectancy is 74, roughly equivalent to that in Brazil. In Chicago, life expectancy in the affluent neighborhoods near downtown on the near north side and in the Loop is 85 years old. In West Garfield Park, that number is fully 16 years less, 69, which is higher than life expectancy in Haiti, but lower than in Egypt. In Atlanta, it's a 13-year swing between the highest and lowest life expectancy, and in Richmond, fully 20 years. Those are, in my view, jaw-dropping numbers, and yet they should come as no surprise. In recent years, some 1.5 million American households with some 3 million children have been living on cash incomes of no more than $2 per person per day. It's no coincidence that inequality is on the rise in Valpo, Richmond, New York, and across the nation, even as the U.S. labor movement's epic decline continues apace. You can see the different lines here. I'm going to talk about this in a moment, that differentiate rates of unionization in the United States and Canada over the last century. Unions were a mighty leveling force in the United States throughout their mid-20th century heyday, offering more than 1/3 of American workers, drawn heavily from the most economically disadvantaged households, a significant wage premium. But their power has waned dramatically in recent decades. You can see it here on the chart with the blue line plummeting. And here again, my current home state of Indiana offers a case in point. In 1964, 41% of Indiana workers belonged to a union, a rate that outpaced that of Illinois and nearly matched that of Michigan, a longtime bastion of labor militancy. By 1989, that number had plummeted almost by half to 21%, and that free fall has continued unabated into the 21st century. In 2012, Indiana joined the ranks of the right-to-work states, now 27 strong. And in 2017 alone, its beleaguered unions lost another 12.5% of their members. As of last count, only 8.9% of Hoosier workers are unionized, despite the fact that labor continues to deliver on payday. The state's non-union workers have a median weekly income of $829, just 80 cents to the dollar of their unionized counterparts, who earn $1,041 a week. Far from exceptional, such disparities in pay are suggestive of the well-established, long-term inverse relationship between union density and income inequality, a relationship you can see here as well. As union membership plummets, the share of income going to the top 10% skyrockets. It's little wonder that in Canada, where both private and public sector workers are more than twice as likely to belong to a union as their U.S. counterparts, contemporary inequality, though growing, is not as sharp. Labor's current predicament springs from a variety of sources. But there is no question that one major factor has been the collapse, really a historic collapse, of Christian support for unions. In the United States today, more than 70% of the population affiliates with a Christian denomination. 6.5% of private sector workers are unionized. 70% versus 6.5%. One might attribute this vast discrepancy in part to apathy, or even just to a gap in Christian formation. I teach the history of Christianity to undergraduates at a Midwestern Lutheran university, and can testify to the fact that many of my students have never considered that their faith might have something to say about wages, for example. They often presume such matters to be dictated by, quote unquote, the market, a veritable force of nature that exists seemingly beyond the purview of Christian social ethics. But the pervasiveness of such ideas, my students' ideas and the ideas of so many others, is no accident. It speaks rather to the tremendous success of a generations-old effort to turn believers against unions. In recent years, historians have recovered so much evidence of this campaign, which first coalesced during the Great Depression as corporate titans forged partnerships with mainline ministers who shared their distaste for the New Deal. The battle against the rising power of unions gained momentum at the grassroots in the 1940s and 1950s when many white Southerners worried that the Congress of Industrial Organization, the most powerful kind of rising union of that day, that their interracial organizing efforts threatened the very heart of the Jim Crow order. Many white Southerners joined the nascent National Association of Evangelicals in working to thwart the ambitions of Operation Dixie, this effort to unionize the South. Meanwhile, Christian libertarians found in the Cold War confrontation with communism an ideal backdrop for their mission to spread the gospel of free enterprise. Its power went fully on display in Sam Walton's expanding Walmart empire, built as it was on a foundation of hard-nosed labor and supply chain practices wrapped in a faith and family-friendly brand. By the 1980s, the anti-union movement had become fully ecumenical, incorporating not just evangelicals and mainliners, but also millions of white Catholics who had moved into the middle class, leaving the worlds of their parents and grandparents behind in more ways than one. Even as they fled the Rust Belt cities that those parents and grandparents had spent their lives in, moving to Sun Belt suburbs, they traded New Deal liberalism for colorblind meritocracy. In due course, such cascading developments yielded a sea change in moral intuitions. As Americans, having long seen inequality as a sin to be stamped out, came to see it as just another fact of life. Today, the distance between the pew and the picket line is so vast that anyone contemplating the relationship between Christianity and labor in the United States could hardly be blamed for lapsing into the old Union song, "Which side are you on?" But it need not be so. If history illumines how we got here, it also suggests alternative ways forward. Believers who are concerned about runaway inequality in the present will find in the past a rich vein of pro-union Christian thought and activism, one that extends back to the earliest days of the American labor movement. So tonight I want to share a little bit of history with you, a story, one that draws upon the research from my first book, Union Made, but as well from the one I'm writing right now. The story set in the late 19th century, a time not so different from our own, when inequality was soaring and the churches were by and large giving their amen to the economic status quo. It's a story about how, quote unquote, ordinary believers decisively changed the church's mind about organized labor, which was the strongest movement of that day against economic inequality. Church leaders, whose livelihood often depended on support from wealthy patrons, had long argued that trade unions were a threat to, among other things, economic freedom, the God-ordained right of every man to negotiate an individual contract with a prospective employer regarding the value of his labor. But over the course of several decades, and especially toward the turn of the 20th century, the clergy finally came to accept what believing labor leaders had long argued, that they were committed to the fight against inequality because the Bible told them so. In the conversation after, I hope that we can think a little bit about this story's implications for our own time and our own circumstances. But without further ado, back to the first Gilded Age we go. If you're familiar with the longer story of Christianity in North America, then you know it became the people's religion first by becoming a religion of and by the people. Throughout the early 19th century, crowds flocked to hear ordinary plain folk revivalists who in fields and boomtowns alike accomplished what their much more aristocratic colonial era predecessors had not, the mass Christianization of the people. People think that it's a story of declining religiosity from the good old days to the present. But the reality is, in the colonial era, very few people went to church. It was really in the early 19th century, as Christianity became more popular, that people became more Christian. But by the middle of the 19th century, and this is key for my story, the northern religious landscape had begun to shift dramatically, as leading churches in urban centers evolved into exclusive hubs of an industrial elite. And here, developments in Chicago were typical. In the city's earliest years, even the most prominent congregations met in simple frame buildings and paid their ministers salaries in the hundreds of dollars, marginally more than local artisans and tradesmen made. But as Chicago grew from an outpost to a metropolis, the well-to-do underwrote the construction of ornate cathedrals and recruited renowned ministers by offering salaries up to 10 times higher than the average worker's wage. Let me give you a few examples of this. Second Presbyterian Church was one of the most prominent churches in 19th century Chicago. It was where a lot of sort of your industrial bigwigs would have attended. And this is the first building that they met in. When they founded the church in 1842, they built this structure for just $1,000. 9 years later, they built this. $90,000. That's in 1851 money. This is Second Presbyterian today on South Michigan Avenue. The building, the 1851 building, burned down in the Great Chicago Fire, and they rebuilt this. This wasn't just a Protestant thing. This is a Holy Family Church, large now Jesuit parish on the near south side of the city. 1857, same story, simple wood frame structure, but 3 years later, this. This is the same building from 1860 with a few additional modifications. Buildings and their growth and expansion and growing ornateness were just one sign of churches' close ties to the wealthy. I don't know how much you know about church finance in the 19th century. I wouldn't expect you to know too much. But one of the primary sources, one of the big problems for churches in the 19th century in the United States was, how are we going to fund ourselves? Obviously, in Europe, the state had been the source of funds. Disestablishment meant that was no longer going to be the case, and so churches had to figure out how to fund themselves. And one of the primary ways they did it was by renting pews. This is a pew rental chart. I know you can't see it in the back, but it's a pew rental chart that has the price of each pew on a quarterly basis. And of course, as you get closer to the front and the center, the pews are more expensive. The further back you are, if you're behind the obstruction over here, that's a nice cheap seat. Holy Family, this is their pew chart. It's a Catholic church. Seats are relatively inexpensive, $3.25 per quarter. So you pay that 4 times a year, roughly $88 a quarter in today's dollars. It wasn't just the amount, though. It wasn't just the amount of money that would become a problem for many working people. It was just the very fact that the interior of the church had been commodified in a way that, in fact, you could buy your better seats and worse seats, that even the seats in church were being bought and sold. If Holy Family was cheap, other churches were much more expensive. Here you can't see this, but this is the total. In 1891, this Congregational church took in $9,000 in pew rents. They needed it. That's about $225,000 in today's dollars. They needed that much money to fund the pastor's $6,000 salary, equivalent to more than $151,000 today. These salaries were another sign of how kind of cozy the church's relationship to capital had become. Robert Patterson, this fellow, was the founding pastor of Second Presbyterian, that first church that I showed you. He started out in 1842 at the founding of the church, making just $600 a year. Basically what the average craftsman at that time would have made. By the time he retired in the early 1870s, he was making more than $5,000 a year. The craftsmen were still making $600. So, in pushing for these kind of vast changes to the religious landscape, where American Christianity, which had been democratized, is now becoming kind of hubs of an industrial elite, the nation's wealthiest Christians sowed the seeds of working class resentment. And they sprouted in the wake of the Civil War. And as church leaders lined up almost to a person, and this is true across denomination, almost to a person in opposition to the early labor movement. Countless working class believers were indignant. One of them, a fellow by the name of Andrew Cameron, he was the editor of the Working Man's Advocate. It was the nation's most important labor newspaper in the decade after the Civil War. This is Cameron. Cameron used his bully pulpit, this labor paper, to ferociously criticize churchly entanglements with bankers, difference. Maybe the bakers too, I don't know. Bankers, industrialists, and the like. Unafraid of brash generalization, Cameron wrote in one issue, "It is a startling fact that the modern pulpit has arrayed itself on the side of the oppressor, has almost invariably defended the aggressions of the moneyed power, and used its high and holy mission to pervert the ways of the Lord." Now, as harsh as those words were, they did not proceed from the pen of an embittered outsider. Cameron was a believing Christian, cognizant of the widespread associations in that time, and maybe to some extent in ours, between working class protest and godlessness. Cameron denied any necessary link between the two. He wrote in the spring of 1868, "Our fight is not against Christianity, but against those who use it as a cloak to secure their selfish purposes." The Working Man's Advocate, his paper, radiated what Cameron called undefiled Christianity. Biblical language permeated his editorials with their freewheeling allusions to the Psalms. "How long, O Lord, how long?" And the Gospels, "The laborer is worthy of his hire." And so did biblical themes of neighbor love and divine judgment. In the Advocate's Thanksgiving 1875 edition, Cameron thanked God for the, quote, "belief that there is a good old-fashioned Orthodox hell." And then he promptly consigned his political and economic enemies to it. Cameron did not triumph a particular sect or creed. He eagerly published and praised Catholic supporters of the labor movement, even as he, as an evangelical, in his paper, carried forward many of the impulses and emphases of the antebellum era's broad evangelical Protestant coalition. Cameron viewed the labor movement as an instrument of God's justice in the world. And he wrote to this effect: "The gospel of Christ sustains us in our every demand. The volume of divine inspiration is the rock of truth upon which our pretensions are founded." He was hardly alone in any of this, in particular in his conviction that elite churches were forsaking ordinary people, and in the process forsaking Christ himself. Maria Darker Wynkoop, another person you'd never have heard of before, I would imagine, immigrated from England to Chicago in 1870. Within a handful of years, this young woman had turned her family's home into the headquarters for a fledgling organization known as the Advocates of Justice. For an apparently brief period of time, this group brought together women and men who sought to reform an economic system that seemed increasingly stacked against the common person. When a reporter asked about the society's more precise mission, Mrs. Wynkoop informed him matter-of-factly that it was to bring glory to God in the highest and peace to people of goodwill. As that comment suggests, a deep Christian faith animated Mrs. Wynkoop's advocacy. But hers was not the theology of the churches. In fact, she often rebuked the Christian elite. In her regular newspaper column, in one piece, she declared, "Did the ministers of the gospel perform their duty and maintain the cause of the struggling poor, as did Christ, our beloved country would not be in the condition it is today." She went on to say, "The poor do not believe in a gospel that is only for the rich and from which they are excluded." And she offered this advice to, quote, well-disposed clergymen. "Visit the laborer at his home. Attend the working man's meetings. Be on hand among striking mechanics and learn the true condition of things." Inspired by those words, one of her readers, signing her name only her initials, HGC, elected to share her thoughts. She said, "At present, the working man is rather repelled than otherwise by the grand church, the grand people who are there, and the grand rent marked on the empty pew he finds his way into." This woman had her own ideas about how to remedy the problem. She said, "Ministers would have a greater influence for good if they opened wide their doors, saying, 'Come one, come all,' and let those that are already there, overlooking all differences in their worldly circumstances, say, by act and word and look, 'We be brethren.'" Industrial warfare. This is a period of industrial warfare. It intensified in the 1870s and 1880s, and as it did, so did the battles within the nation's Christian churches. The rhetoric emanating from Protestant pulpits was often as violent as the scenes in the streets. I don't know how many of you know about the 1877 Railroad Riots. Historians call 1877 the year of violence because it was a year in which across the continent, workers rose up against the railroads, which had colluded to suppress wages, and it started on the East Coast and moved west. And as it did, in city after city and out in the fields, workers clashed with police and militia and often ended up dead. And this is a scene in Harper's Weekly in Chicago, a famous battle on the near south side between the butchers who were marching with the emblems of their trade through the streets of the south side of Chicago, and met a group of police who fired into the crowd, emptied their guns, ran off, reloaded, came back, fired into the crowd. Several dozen workers were dead by the end of it all. In the wake of these riots, one Methodist minister declared, I think this is shocking language. I was shocked the first time I heard it. One of the worst features of the riot is it did not cost enough human lives. Something like 20 fell under that first volley. It were better if it had been 200. It would have taught those lawless beings the cost of human lives, that it cost them something to defy the law. I was even more surprised doing this research when I realized that some workers agreed with this pastor. A press report on the sermon included this sentence that just caught my attention. I couldn't let it go. "The people turned to each other with looks of approval, and occasionally a movement of that sort commonly described in brackets by the intelligent reporter as sensation swayed them." Who were these saints, several hundred in all, who cheered such lusty cries for workers' blood? They were themselves workers, respectable and English-speaking. People like James Dixon, a teamster, and Anna Quayle, a milliner, who had not lost faith in industrial capitalism, and who did not imagine that their interests were in any way tied to the interests of those workers in the streets. But if that was where James Dixon and Anna Quayle were, a growing number of workers, and from kind of the widest possible spectrum of labor reform, socialists, anarchists, and trade unionists alike, were beginning to insist that Christian leaders had forsaken the religion of Christ. Many working people press their theological case in the streets. Workers have theological intuitions. They don't always write theological treatises, but even in the streets, they enact theological ideas. Consider the scene at the 1885 opening of Chicago's new Board of Trade building. Here's another image from Harper's Weekly. You can see maybe perhaps some of the kind of images of the building itself, this temple to commerce, and I'll talk about that scene on the bottom right here in just a second. The city's Christian elite had helped to orchestrate this celebration surrounding the construction and completion of this $1.5 million structure. When the cornerstone was laid in mid-December of 1882, Reformed Episcopal Bishop Charles Edward Cheney prayed what the Tribune called an impressive prayer, saying in part, "We thank thee that thou hast blessed the efforts of those who have been instrumental in the commercial prosperity of this great city." At the 1885 dedication, meanwhile, Episcopal Reverend Clinton Locke petitioned God for favor, announcing before a crowd of 4,000 people, "We are met here to dedicate to the trade and commerce of this city this noble temple. And as our forefathers ever did, and as we pray thee our descendants may ever do, we would first ask thy blessing on our work." That same day, just blocks away, leading socialist Albert Parsons riled a massive crowd of protesters. You can't see it too well in the back, but that bottom right picture is Parsons riling a large crowd of people protesting the opening of the Board of Trade. Parsons cried aloud, "A temple was being dedicated to the god of Mammon, to be devoted exclusively to the robbery, the plunder, and the destruction of the people. When the cornerstone was laid, Bishop Cheney was there to baptize it." He went on, "What a truthful follower that man must be of the tramp Nazarene Jesus." The crowd, theological intuitions on display, erupted into laughter and then into cheers when he added, "Who scourged the thieves from the Board of Trade of Jerusalem." This vision of Jesus as a staunch defender of the poor against the powerful had wide currency in radical circles. One of the things when I teach this period that I always try to impress upon my students is radical circles were much larger back then than I think they are, at least in the United States today. Christian socialism was a large phenomenon, a large network of people across not just this continent, but back in Europe who were thinking about the potentially radical implications of the gospel. And as a result, there are a lot of folks here and elsewhere who have fears, legit fears of revolution, especially after 1886, when in Chicago a bomb exploded in Haymarket Square on the near west side of the city. This is a contemporary portrait of that bomb exploding. This was not a Chicago event. This was a world event in 1886 that sent shudders through the middle and upper classes who were concerned that, in fact, this might be the revolution that had been predicted. One of the fellows involved in this, Parsons was involved, but so was a fellow named August Spies. Moments before being led to the scaffold on the morning of 11 November 1887, one of the condemned Haymarket anarchists told the First Methodist Church's pastor, Henry Bolton, "Now I die like Jesus died, at the hands of my murderers." That speaker was almost certainly August Spies, who had first made what the papers called a blasphemous comparison in an impassioned courtroom speech just before his sentencing the previous year. He went on to explain in considerable detail in a letter to his fiancée. He said, "You will probably remember the crucifixion of a young, bright, generous, and noble-hearted Jew by the name of Jesus. And in connection with this incident, you will likewise remember that a few days prior to his legal murder, he had entered the temple of Jerusalem, which he found occupied by the Board of Trademen of that city." Spies quoted the passage from Matthew's Gospel that recounts how Jesus overturned the money changers' tables. And then he went on to say, "And when the Jerusalem Board of Trademen saw their respectable business thus exposed by this, quote, foreign, half-distracted, wild-eyed, ranting agitator, and when they saw that his words were listened to eagerly by the people, they formed a conspiracy, drummed up some charges against the lawless fiend, and crucified him as a convicted felon." Spies concluded, "You will readily see the analogy of this in our own case." So that's the radical Jesus. But if some workers embraced dissenting Christologies, a radical historical Jesus, countless others stake their claim as the true voices of Christian orthodoxy. In 1886, one of the nation's leading Christian businessmen, John Farwell, penned a letter that read in part, "Let the true Knight of Labor," Knights of Labor was one of the largest sort of labor reform organizations of the late 19th century. Farwell said, "Let the true Knight of Labor be a thorough student of the four Gospels of the New Testament and become a true follower of Christ." A word about Farwell. Farwell, in addition to being one of the most important businessmen in the country, was a major benefactor of D.L. Moody, the famed revival preacher who attracted crowds across the country, across the industrializing world in the late 19th century. Moody's a kind of interesting character in this story because in many ways he shared workers' concerns about churchly ties to the wealthy. He denounced churches which had allowed themselves to become, quote, aristocratic clubs for the few rich and respectable. And Moody, at his revival meetings, made a point of allowing the poor to enter and select their seats first. So in many ways, a kind of different approach than many of the established churches of his time. But, and this is where Moody's complicated, he saw labor as the problem, not the answer. And on this point, he and Farwell agreed, hence the letter calling for these knights to study the Gospels and become true followers of Christ. Well, the letter set off a total firestorm in the working class Christian community. One Knight of Labor, unable to fully contain his disgust, crafted this retort. "As a student of the four Gospels, I have learned that there is a fair prospect for the Knights of Labor to reach the kingdom of heaven. But I can hardly see any chance at all for Mr. Farwell. It would be easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for him to get there. That is the decision of the New Testament. Mr. Farwell, of course, does not believe the New Testament. And the evidence of his infidelity is this, that although he is a richer man than any man that lived in Judea at the time of Christ, yet he is trying to be richer still. He is working very hard and very successfully to make himself ineligible for a place in the kingdom." Such theological skirmishes were part of a broader power struggle unfolding within the nation's Christian institutions. Workers who were convinced that God favored the poor were also determined to see that perspective prevail within the churches. But they were realizing this truth, and I would argue this is true much more broadly in the history of Christianity, that if you want to make social reform happen, biblical and moral arguments are essential, but they will not deliver institutional change on their own. Social organizing is required, and workers were ready to organize, not just unions, but within the churches. They found an opportunity when almost to a person, so this is now a generation into the labor movement, the clergy opposed the Pullman strike of 1894. I don't know how many of you have heard of this strike. This was one of the kind of iconic strikes of the late 19th century. It became iconic because workers in this small town right on the south sort of side of Chicago who worked for George Pullman, he made luxury train cars. Pullman had imagined this town as a kind of model town, a town that would solve, it was the answer to the problems of industrial society because he was going to give workers everything they could ever want. A beautiful home, beautiful church, shopping malls, parks, everything, sort of idyllic community. But he owned it all. You couldn't own property there if you were a worker. You couldn't have a beer. If you wanted to have a beer, you had to go to Kensington, which was just down the street. But if you went to Kensington, you could be fired. Pullman was very intensely concerned on a kind of control. And so when a depression hit in 1893 and he cut wages, but not rents, mind you, he owned all the property in town, so he cut wages but not rents, workers went on strike. And what made this strike so interesting and so important was that it wasn't just a small local dispute. Workers across the country proceeded to declare a boycott of any train carrying a Pullman car. It was really one of the first displays of working class solidarity and showcased the power of labor to bring, so David could defeat Goliath, it appeared, until a federal injunction declared the strike illegal soon after the strike was broken. But in Chicago and around the country, the strike had lasting religious consequences because workers were fed up. The clergy had once again come to the defense of industry. And so during the strike, many working class Catholics stopped their subscription to church newspapers out of frustration with the editor's refusal to side decisively with the American Railway Union. That kind of protest was mild when compared with what happened in the sanctuaries of Pullman town. And a lot of connections actually here that would be of interest to you. A lot of Dutch folks in Pullman actually during this era. And a lot of conflict within Dutch churches over this strike. In a Swedish Lutheran congregation, tempers flared when the priest denounced the union. When he refused to recant, working class parishioners denounced him as a scab minister. A similar backlash at the nearby First Christian Reformed Church prompted the minister presiding there to back off his criticisms of the strike. But nowhere was working class resistance more concerted than at Pullman Presbyterian Church, another church that actually had quite a number of Dutch. The minister there was good buddies with George Pullman, and when he railed against the strike, working people left that church in droves. It was a really fascinating moment in the research for this book when I discovered, I had this hunch. I was like, I went to church growing up, but I knew that you didn't always just accept what the pastor had to say. It wasn't like the pastor had the last word. It was, you listen to the sermon, and then you go to lunch, and you talk about it. So I thought, what were these folks talking about? And sure enough, you find that the fellow opposes the strike, and they leave. Interestingly, and this is important, all but a handful immediately reaffiliated with other nearby churches, making clear they were not abandoning Christianity. They were abandoning a particular church, which had become too closely identified with capital. All these efforts, all these organizing efforts were not in vain. Collectively, workers sent the Christian elite over the edge with mounting anxiety that the churches were losing their foothold among the people. Catholics were deeply worried about the influence of socialism, which, as I said, was a significant movement during this period. They were very worried that trade unions were going to become a kind of avenue into socialism for their people, and an avenue, therefore, out of the church. Protestants were very worried about the loss of especially men, male workers. Women have outnumbered men in Protestant churches on this continent as long as there have been Protestant churches on this continent. It's the reality. It's the truth. But from time to time, this comes to seem a crisis, and this was one of those times. Workers were acutely aware that their pastors and their priests were alarmed about the possibility that workers were going to leave the churches en masse, and they did everything they could to exploit those worries. So if you want to know how they changed the church's mind, it wasn't the moral arguments at the end of the day that did it. It was these kinds of efforts. Socialist newspapers published cartoons like this one. You can see, I don't know if you can read it at the back. Up at the top it says treasures in heaven and elsewhere. And you've got this minister with one hand behind his back and a capitalist. It says, the label capitalist, stuffing some bills into his hand. And at the bottom it says, let not thy right hand know what thy left hand doeth. This was the kind of needling that was really had the churches on edge. So did these kinds of headlines. This is an article on a church's attempt to reach out to workers. They were worried about workers. They said, okay, let's reach out. Let's have working men's dinners. And so that sounds like a good idea. First of working men's dinners. You can imagine the business folk picking up this paper and reading that headline, but then reading the subtitle. Toilers do not materialize at the Fulton Street Methodist Church. This is the kind of thing that was driving people crazy. Workers actually during the late 19th century founded churches of their own. They got so fed up with the established churches that they founded labor churches. This is a movement across a transatlantic movement, actually. And again, a movement that got a lot of headlines and had a lot of people really deeply worried that they were going to lose their foothold, which was not just about numbers. It wasn't just about that. It was also about kind of the psychology of a Christian society. That hope for a Christian society seemed to really be on the ropes. So, desperate to avoid losing touch with the working classes, turn-of-the-century church leaders began to take their critics more seriously. been saying these things for a generation with really little impact on church attitudes toward labor. But as the turn of the 20th century approached, church leaders issued repeated surveys which found that the church's opposition to the trade unions was a major source of working class religious disenchantment. This is kind of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, of the turn of the 20th century, trying to figure out why aren't people coming to church? And the workers say time and time again, it's because of your position on labor. One of these studies, conducted by a Baptist minister, was published in the American Journal of Sociology in 1899 under the title, The Working Man's Alienation from the Church. This minister sent the letter at the top of the page here out across the country, inquiring about the sources of working men's alienation from the churches. He received a number of replies from prominent leaders in the trade union world, the Sam Gompers of the world, but he was most interested in what the non-church-going worker had to say for himself. Many of these respondents cited a perception, in the words of one man, quote, very simply, the churches are opposed to the working man. But even those who were most disaffected from institutional Christianity articulated a deep attachment to Jesus. One declared, Jesus Christ is with us outside the church, and we shall prevail with God. While another said, most of the ministers are muzzled by their masters and dare not preach the gospel of the carpenter of Nazareth. And that idea of Jesus as a carpenter was a deeply resonant symbol for many workers. The minister summed up some of these workers' proposed remedies. Quote, apply the Sermon on the Mount. Preach Christianity instead of theology. Let the pastor have a personal relation with the needs of labor. Be our champion. Such findings were replicated time and time again, and before long, leading church people, Protestants and Catholics alike, found themselves confronted by a stark choice. Change your views on the labor question or abandon your hopes for a Christian America. It's no coincidence that during those very same years, nearly every major Christian denomination warmed to organized labor, endorsing social creeds that echoed workers' long-standing insistence that the radical inequalities of the Gilded Age contradicted both the spirit and the letter of the gospel. The American Catholic hierarchy had long emphasized the anti-socialist provisions of Rerum Novarum. This was a groundbreaking encyclical in 1891 on labor. But in 1906, a young priest by the name of John Ryan picked up on the encyclical's critique of untrammeled economic freedom and drove it home in his book, A Living Wage, its ethical and economic aspects, which would become a springboard to an influential life of activism and Catholic institution building on behalf of the poor and working classes. Arguably the most famous of the new social teachings on the Protestant side, the Methodist Social Creed, was ratified by the Federal Council of Churches immediately following its founding in 1908. This document called, among other things, for equal rights and complete justice for all men in all stations of life. More specifically, for the abolition of child labor, for the suppression of the sweating system, and for a living wage in every industry. And if you had been a worker fighting for these changes for a generation, these were monumental breakthroughs. The same pressures that produced those social creeds led to the early 20th century adoption of Labor Sunday, an annual celebration of labor in churches of nearly every denomination. It gave many a minister the opportunity to reflect on the social implications of the gospel, and many more the chance to hand their pulpits over to workers, as happened on a number of occasions across the country. Andrew Cameron, that fellow I showed you up at the beginning, didn't live to see the day when glove makers and printers and the like stood not in protest of, but rather behind the pulpit. But if he had, he surely would have been gratified by it. He would have been especially delighted in what happened in 1913 when a blacksmith by the name of James W. Klein was asked to address the Methodist clergy of the Rock River Conference at their annual meeting. Klein is the fifth from the left here. He's a fascinating figure. He's an evangelical Christian and a nationally renowned labor leader who in 1913 was serving as the president of the International Brotherhood of Blacksmiths. Listen to what he had to say at this gathering of ministers. The theme of the session was the working man in the church, and Klein began in good evangelical fashion, reading aloud from the New Testament. Behold, the hire of the laborers who have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth. And the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Staring out at the crowd, Klein went on, I believe that I can see the conditions of our day depicted in the 5th chapter of James, and would like to hear a few sermons preached from that chapter, adding pointedly, I never have heard an interpretation. Well, he didn't hesitate to offer his own. In a lengthy address, he indicted the nation for allowing men of large wealth to become an invisible government, and then rebuked the churches for taking on the spirit of Caesar. His speech built toward this climactic litany. Behold, the National Beef Packers Association at their banquet at the Congress Hotel in Chicago, where possibly $75,000 was spent on an extravagant dinner. Did you read the account of it? Behold, they have kept back by fraud the hire of their laborers working in their packing houses as low as 15 cents an hour, which makes it possible for them to waste it in extravagant living. Behold, the hire of the laborers in the steel mills at Gary, Indiana, with Mr. Gary at the head, donating back in charity that which should be given them in wages, and building memorial churches with the money kept back by fraud. After pronouncing judgment on the United States Steel Corporation, as well as the cotton, mining, and retail industries, he concluded with this line, Behold, the hire of the laborers who have done all this so that others could live in pleasure and wickedness. Their gold and their silver is cankered. It is burning their flesh like fire. That night, labor's gospel appeared triumphant. A little over 100 years later, we find ourselves in a very different moment. But my contention, and I'll leave you with this, is that if we are ever to find our way out of this new Gilded Age, then we must embrace the insights gleaned from the last. That indeed, the laborer is worthy of her hire. And that yes, the demands of justice and the priority of human solidarity require some limits to economic freedom. These insights were woven deeply into the fabric of both the New Deal and the Great Society, legislative packages that included strong support for workers and their families. These insights infused the Christian activism of a whole host of 20th century giants, from Dorothy Day to Cesar Chavez to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. You may recall that Dr. King, whose birthday we just celebrated in the United States, spent the last weeks of his life campaigning on behalf of striking sanitation workers in Memphis, who flocked to his message that, quote, it is criminal to have people working on a full-time basis and a full-time job getting part-time income. King spent many of the last years of his life, here he is marching with those workers. Many of the last years of his life fighting not just for civil rights for African Americans, but for unions and for their advance in American society. Collectively, the activism of these giants and many, many, many ordinary believers besides brought the nation to the cusp of the mountaintop. It's easy to forget that at the very moment in 1968, in the weeks before King's death, when he was so urgently speaking about economic inequality, calling the nation to repent, that at that very moment we were more economically equal than we have ever been, and much, much less equal today. It's amazing what can happen when church and labor join forces. Only in the last half century, as their once strong friendship has devolved into hostility, has a chasm reopened between the rich and poor in our society. So I believe we are in desperate need of a revival of pro-labor Christian social teaching. It would do more than just offer a much-needed boost to beleaguered labor unions. The truth is that if we can move beyond this "which side are you on" mentality, both sides will surely benefit. North American churches right now are struggling to navigate a tidal wave of religious disaffiliation, a tidal wave which is strongest among young people who are deeply concerned about their prospects in our increasingly unequal society. And so I believe that churches may well find that any and all support lent to the labor movement redounds to their own revitalization as well. But the best reasons for rekindling the friendship of church and labor have less to do with institutional preservation than with what is just and true. Don't take my word for it. Listen to the voices of those working class saints who have gone before. If we have the ears to hear their keen moral arguments, we will find that they resonate still today. Thank you very much. Okay, I will.
Take a seat on the hot. See why he deserves it? It's great stuff. Thanks so much. It's a great lecture. We have a brief response from another longtime friend. His name is Dewart. He's the provincial director of the Christian Labour Association of Canada that practices a lot, although differently, and look forward to hearing of that. Of what Heath recommends that we preach. So I'd like to invite my friend and colleague Dewart to come forward and speak.
Great. Well, I'd like to start by thanking Dr. Carter, or congratulating Dr. Carter on receiving this award tonight, and for his remarks. In his recent published works and in this talk, I think that he's skillfully prodding believers to confront tough questions about what is to be done for workers, and in particular the working poor, in our era of increasing economic disparity. While you've noted not to the same extent, this disparity is true in Canada today. Our Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives reports that whereas a CEO in 1995 earned approximately 85 times that of the average Canadian worker, today's CEO earns an average of $10 million annually, a whopping 197 times more than their average employee. In Ontario, there's a growing anxiety about how to attend to the issues created by our increasing reliance on contract and temporary workers, and about how to create opportunities in the labor market for particular groups that are perennially sidelined. This debate has played out quite actively here in Ontario's legislature recently, with major seesaw changes in labor laws as one government has replaced another. Additionally, whether it's resource-rich Fort McMurray or bountiful Niagara fruit harvests, our country has become increasingly reliant on migrant and temporary foreign workers who live and work among us. These workers, while benefiting in the riches this country has to offer, are also incredibly susceptible to exploitation and mistreatment. Asking what the church might say or do about conditions for workers in a modern and fast-changing economy is timely and relevant. Personally, I was encouraged by Dr. Carter's illumination of the work of thoughtful Christians who were active in Chicago's labor movement during the late 19th century. Activists like Andrew Cameron and the Knights of Labor are just a few of the prominent and memorable Christian worker advocates who contributed to developing a right response to the excesses and abuses that industrialization brought to quickly urbanizing city centers. As Dr. Carter points out, the writings and the organizing efforts of these early Christian activists can be instructive today. In preparing for this panel, and because it's Redeemer, I reviewed a quote from Dutch theologian and political actor Abraham Kuyper. In 1891, when Europe had already for many years been in the throes of a seismic and volatile ideological contest taking place in the political and economic arenas of that day, Kuyper addressed a Christian social congress that had gathered to wrestle with the social questions prompted by the massive and rapid industrialization in Western Europe. Said Kuyper, At the late date of this Congress, we find ourselves fighting a rearguard action. The socialists themselves, and not only our Christian leaders, expose our failure to act. We should feel humiliated that in the face of so crying a need, we have not long since been acting in the name of Jesus. If Dr. Carter will permit the comparison, it seems to me that in some ways his work too is sounding an alarm for faithful Christians and calling them to action. I want to offer just a few ideas in response to his remarks this evening. First, unions do play an important role in the development and maintenance of a just and fair society, even today. Throughout scriptures, it's clear that the imperative to demonstrate love is best manifested through care for the hungry, the widowed, the foreigner in our land, the orphaned, and the oppressed. In Isaiah 58, God rejects the pious acts and religious activity of the Israelites because in the meantime, they've been exploiting the workers and ignoring the vulnerable among them. With Isaiah in mind, it's possible to say that believers cannot engage in worthy worship if they're not also concerned with the effects of poverty and worker exploitation. But the call here is not simply to be benevolent or to act charitably. I would suggest it's not too much of a stretch to suggest that as prerequisite to meaningful worship, we are called to attend to the structures, the systems, and the behaviors that can either exacerbate or alleviate inequality and injustice. Like Dr. Carter, I think trade unions are important institutions in this regard. We live in a complex political, legal, and economic system, and the world we inherit is rife with the consequences of the pursuit of selfish personal gain. It is within that context, a world that is both complex and broken, that we should understand the place of trade unions. At its core, a union is an assembly of workers, organized to harness the strength of a coordinated, collective voice and strategic action. A union is an effective counterbalance to the inherent power imbalance in the employment contract. It deploys its influence in the boardroom, in the legislature, in the courts, and in the media to advance the interests and the insights of workers, and in doing so, serves as one feature among a more complete set of checks and balances between those with power, political influence, and capital, and those without. As example of the mediating effect that unions can have in society, I would point to the impact of the union Solidarność in Poland during the late 80s, and to the workers' rights movements in China that is being nurtured today by an organization called the China Labor Bulletin. In both of these examples, worker movements challenge unholy and oppressive power regimes. These movements also serve to incubate ideas and to develop leadership skills that in time have or will serve to reshape the ordering and governing of those nations. I'll confess that it's not entirely clear to me how or if the church can be on a side per se, but certainly, as Dr. Carter demonstrates, the church has too often taken a non-neutral position on the question of labor. About 20 years ago, a former colleague of mine, John Sutherland, undertook a poll to understand the official position of various church denominations in Canada on trade unionism. He demonstrated that many had an overtly dismissive and in some cases even hostile view of labor unions and union membership. My own personal views on the need for and purpose of unions are informed both by my Christian faith and by 18 years of representing workers. To me, a union provides the means to effect justice in the workplace, to inspire mercy and restraint in those who wield economic and political power, and to bring shalom in the face of conflict. This is a function that neither the state nor the corporate HR department can ever replicate. CLAC's advocacy in the workplace and in the public square demonstrates daily how an empowered assembly of 60,000 workers, staff, and elected officials can positively affect the world of work, the working conditions of its own members, and workers generally. If I can offer a word of critique for Dr. Carter's comments tonight, and he told me over dinner that I could, so it's okay. It would be for what seems to me an underlying premise that the singular role of the union is to engage in a battle for income equality. As believers in a broken but hope-filled world, we can attend to the labor question as more than just combatants in the fight for a just wage. If we accept the Christian view of our place in the world as co-creators, it should motivate in us high ideals about the dignity, the purpose and the meaning of work. When we subscribe to the idea that the image of the Creator is imprinted in every person, then collective bargaining isn't just an act of achieving fair compensation for a hard day's work, but also about inviting workers into the enterprise as respected partners, as problem solvers, as equals. The ongoing work of the monthly Labor Management Committee isn't just a forum for shrill complaints or a tool to avoid costly litigation arising from workplace disputes, but instead, a chance for workers and managers to collaboratively address the everyday common challenges of the workplace. From this perspective, the Christian perspective, work is not merely a means to an end, and the workplace should not be reduced to a perpetual battleground between labor and capital. From this perspective, one can advance the view that work should be made meaningful, fulfilling, and rewarding. And if that is what orients our activities in the labor movement, a union can develop its advocacy efforts, its programs, its services, and worker supports in pursuit of a distinct, different, and perhaps even wholly ideal. Lastly, I will submit that it's also necessary to place unions within their proper context. They are, after all, institutions that are filled with and run by broken human beings. Like corporations, political parties, and any other human undertaking, they too are prone to the misuse of power and the effects of a greedy heart. CLAC's founders, many of whom had experienced a model of trade unionism that had developed in Western Europe, were dismayed with what they found in the Canadian labor movement in the late 50s and early 60s. That movement had been deeply and uniformly impacted by an ideology that was anathema to their faith. In their view, the North American labor movement had become, as in some cases, had become as exploitative as the corporations that the unions were supposed to hold in check. In response, they established a worker organization, open to all, guided by clear ideals, that was both worker advocate and a reform movement within the movement. In my view, CLAC and the many other faith-based trade unions around the globe are precise examples of how Christians, looking to live out their call in this world, can attend to the labor questions of our day. In closing, I want to reiterate the importance of Dr. Carter's work in this moment and how much I appreciated being able to listen to you tonight and to have read some of your material before coming. And I want to thank him and Redeemer for creating an opportunity to discuss these important questions. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ian. It's my pleasure right now to sort of moderate the discussion and throw a couple stones at the hornet's nest, and that's why I'm putting them beside each other. I'm also going to be searching for questions and comments for the crowd. If you don't have any, I'll be disappointed, and I'm just going to walk out. That's the students. I was looking especially at you. You know, if you're from CLAC, you are barred from talking. Ian talks enough for all of you. I guess I'll open by asking you, Heath, to respond. And it was Ian posed a question that I was hoping to ask as well. So, which is, to what extent does your case for the relationship of Christianity and labor rely on the problem of inequality?
Yeah. Well, I thought that what you were saying about sort of the role of unions in a society being larger, and I thought, especially, you said something about not just unions are not just potential vehicles for seeking just compensation, but inviting workers to sit down and have a collaborative relation. To me, that sounds ideal. I think the thing, and I'd be curious to know, you have a lot of hands-on experience. My sense in the American labor context, just knowing friends in the labor movement, is that oftentimes it can be tough to establish that kind of collaborative relationship. And there's so much work that's being done in the United States to beat back unions, to prevent workplaces from being organized, that I guess to me, what you're talking about sounds like the land of milk and honey a little bit, in the sense of, the time where we can all sit down, the line will lay down in the land of the workers, and the ownership, that seems ideal. And so, I'm not in any way opposed to that. My sense from both the period the historical period that I study, and from what I can gather, at least from kind of the contemporary American context, is that there's a lot more of a conflictual kind of relationship, and that if workers were just to seek collaborative relationships, would they be met? I mean, I guess I just wonder whether it would work, and how you've gotten people to actually be willing to do that. And I don't know if there are differences in sort of the legal framework where here maybe employers are compelled in some way to be more open to that than they are in the United States. So I don't know. I mean, I'm very open to the idea, and also to the idea that unions are imperfect. I mean, I don't want to romanticize and think that, you know, unions in the American context either are always doing things right. The problem that I have is when, in the American context, often what happens is people will use the flaws in unions to say, well, we just need to get rid of them. That's often the move, and it's true in teachers' unions. It's true in a lot of different contexts where they say, well, look, you know, they're protecting these teachers who don't want to actually, you know, improve. We need to break the union, and my feeling is no. The union is imperfect. The union needs to be reformed. The union needs some kind of work done to it, but we can't get rid of it altogether, which is so much of the impetus. So I don't know. What do you?
Ian, grab that microphone. But Heath, you should know most Americans think that about Canada. That it's the land of milk and honey.
Yeah. My presumptions have only been confirmed. Yeah. I mean, in this day, yeah.
Hewers of wood, drawers of water, takers of milk, eaters of honey. Ian, go ahead.
So, the different perspectives from which we start. You come into this equation at a point in the Wild West of the labor movement. There were no structures, there were no systems, there was no legal framework within which unions would get the right to bargain or represent workers or to resolve disputes. And the tradition that I come into this question from is one that came to the Canadian labor movement when it was at its peak in terms of exposure and density, and that it had in that time had accumulated a number of practices and flaws that the founders of CLAC pointed to as problematic. So we come to this question from these two different perspectives, which will animate part of this discussion. But in terms of the notion that that sounds ideal, or perhaps the land of milk and honey, I can say that when you put this stuff into practice at the ground or at the level of the bargaining at the workplace, it doesn't look so neat, and it's certainly not so clean. The challenge of mediating dispute and advocating for workers as their agent in contests of power between they and their employer is not simple or easy. And in the desire to achieve partnership or collaboration, we cannot forego the need to demand justice or to fulfill our role as the advocate in the workplace. But it's that notion that if work is partner-focused, if the worker has a collaborative and equal role in the enterprise and is brought into the equation as a participant of worth, if that's what orients our activity, then the other pieces, the less desirable pieces, are necessary. They need attention. They can't be overlooked. But it keeps our eye on the prize, as it were, as to what we're hoping to achieve. And in my view, one of the reasons that CLAC grows in the face of shrinking union density is because it offers that hope-filled vision of what labor and labor relations can be, even though it's often not always that clean or as nice.
I mean, I think, I don't doubt that there's still a lot of sort of struggle in working out the details and working out arrangements. Part of what I guess I'm curious about, and it may just be also, again, here a difference, is just that in the United States, both among workers, there's a need to convince workers that unions are good. Many American workers are anti-union today. I mean, it's, widespread. And in fact, it's very difficult to get unions going in many parts of the United States today. So it's not just convincing employers, but it's also convincing workers. I mean, I guess there's just when I talk about sort of the collapse of support, there's such a thoroughgoing suspicion of unions at all. And so many employers can basically count on the fact that they won't have to deal with the union at all. There was a couple of years ago in the South, an auto worker that successfully fought back an attempt to organize their plant. And part of the way to do it is they got some of the workers in the plant to make videos about why they oppose the union. I mean, so it's there's a way in which, that's the context that I'm partly thinking about here, is how in that context do you even build up the idea that the kind of thing you're talking about is a good thing, where, hey, workers should have an opportunity to sit down in a kind of partnership or collaborative relationship with management, when for management and for some workers in the United States, it's sort of like, well, we're just going to work without it. It's the way, we're going to do the market, or we're going to do whatever, I mean, there's lots of different justifications for it, but we don't need that structure at all. So I feel like that's where I'm coming from, is partly that we have to convince people that there's a need for a structure. Then there's the question of, like, what should that structure be doing, I don't know.
Well, I think you certainly come from a very different context. I know a story of Volkswagen,
Yeah.
I think it was Tennessee, where they had a plant, and having been used to dealing with industrialized, unionized workers, invited the UAW into its plant to come sign up workers. And incredible amount of money spent by outside forces to dissuade those workers from joining a union that the employer had invited in to come speak to them. So very different context in which we operate.
Yeah.
And it's certainly no disagreement from me, and I think my colleagues, that the declining density rates of unions, and as seen as more precipitous in the States, is not better for our society.
Yeah.
Doesn't leave workers in a better place, leaves them actually less capable of participating, not just in work, but in the broader political economic structures that their society depends on.
Yeah.
Ed, I've got you. I'm going to ask one more question just because that's what I do, hawk the mic. So I'm going to just live into myself, so keep my reputation up, and then I'm going to look to the crowd. Because there was one thing that you said, Heath, towards the end that I think is very provocative, and I think it actually will be a very good start for this conversation. I sense something Ian has in mind. You made this you said, look, there's this biblical call for justice in the workplace, and then there's organizing. Right? And it almost seemed as if you were, and I'm looking forward to you correcting me on this, but that there was a sort of dichotomy that you're making. Look, there's the gospel, and then there's the let's get the damn union in the workplace. And it struck me that whether the question is whether or not it's possible to even think organizationally as a Christian, or to think as a Christian about what an organization might be, whether there's a biblical view of the organization. And just I want to read, because we're at Redeemer, and this is the only place I can do this without getting stoned or having nobody know what I'm talking about. Let's read a bit from Abraham Kuyper. In 1891, at the very same time that those pew rent charts that you were showing, he says this about, this is in his text on manual labor. Have anyone read On Manual Labor? Raise your hand. I should buy too many of you to buy a beer for, but he says this: organization, which we support, assumes that the realm of labor is a world of its own and best suited to determine its own interests. The government the government, which is given authority from God, does not adequately represent sub-entities such as capital or labor. For that reason, we have always insisted that labor be organized on the basis of constitutional law. Labor stands on the opposite side of capital, unarmed and defenseless. It does not constitute a counterbalance because it is camped outside in the open field outside of the law. So what Kuyper is doing there is saying that we actually need to think Christianly about organization. So I'd love to hear your, and I think this response sort of gets at the heart of what your Ian is saying. Look, we need to think. Can you respond to that?
Yeah, I know. I wasn't trying to juxtapose those as though they are, at odds with one another. That somehow organizing is at odds with the biblical or moral argument. Just that moral arguments don't change institutions on their own. That there has to be some legs to it, and I think the legs can be very Christian legs, but you have to work at it. I mean, I think this is true whether on labor issues, it's true on racial issues, it's true on a whole host of issues that institutions are often slow to change, and they're often not convinced until they feel threatened, under threat, and it doesn't have to be a threat like in the sense of some unchristian approach to those institutions, but I think that as these workers that I was talking about are doing, they're organizing kind of against church leadership on Christian grounds, and making a case that in fact the churches have gone astray, and calling them, I think, in a kind of a sort of Reformation spirit, calling the churches back to themselves. So, I mean, I think that I'm glad they did. And I don't see what they were doing there as being somehow incompatible with their moral arguments. Just to say that, they made those moral arguments for a half century and got nowhere. It really wasn't until they found ways to put pressure on the institution that the moral argument, for whatever reason, wasn't able to sustain on its own. So, I don't see the organizing piece as anti. I mean, I think it's very, very much compatible, but sort of different phases. The moral arguments, they made those for decades and didn't get very far, and then they started to organize, and they got a lot further. Even as they continue to make those moral arguments.
Yeah. You want to respond to that, Ian?
I only in this way. I like the story so much about challenging the church and its pew rent practices as a form of demonstrating what happens when workers can come together and use that institutional organization to amplify their voice, to challenge things that they know to be untrue. The theology of the worker is true, regardless of whether the preacher agrees. And they demonstrate the power and the capacity to bring reform, even to the church. But only possible because of their ability to amass their resources and speak with one voice or one collective voice.
Okay, we're going to turn it over to you. Ed Grotenboer had his hand first, so I'm going to recognize you first, Ed.
Very briefly, thank you, Dr. Craig.
Yeah.
A week is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But I'd like to challenge you a bit.
Good.
How is your view of the necessity for labor unions removed from the class level view of society? I know that's radical wording because we know what that implicates. The whole society is right at once, and there's a lot of socialists who still believe that that is the way to address income gaps.
Yeah.
And to it, and I'm with Ian in terms that one should not limit the role of the trade union to just the economic side. That also takes you away from the class, I don't want to say struggle again, the warfare
Yeah.
between the haves and the have-nots.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a lot of ground
Yeah.
that in the workplace that is not covered
Uh-huh.
by the income
Yeah.
perspective.
I don't know that I'm strongly ideological in my response to this question. I mean, I think what I would say is the proof is sort of in the pudding here. That we, for a generation, had strong unions in American society, and it also happened to be the generation that saw the greatest sort of level of economic democracy, sort of relative. I mean, it's still a society with relatively sharp class division or class differentiation, but a society that was, on the whole, much more economically equal than the one we have now. I mean, I don't know that it's workers that in American society today or in the 19th century were really pushing any kind of class war. If anything, I would say that, and I tried to sort of very briefly give an overview of this, that the war on unions, there has been a war on unions in American society. And it's been a very successful one. And it's convinced lots and lots of not just business and management types, but like I said, lots of workers, that unions are somehow counter to their interests, despite sort of lots of evidence to the contrary. So I see unions, I didn't feel, as you were talking, a strong sense of disagreement with the idea that unions are an important mediating institution in our society, and in the absence of them, Ian said something about the inherent power, forgive me if I think inherent power imbalance in the employment contract. I mean, that's the fundamental problem, as I see it, in American sort of, at the root of the economic inequality that we see in the United States is workers have no power in our society. And that's a huge issue. And unfortunately, I am just reformed enough to believe that, people will take advantage of that. And they are, and they have, I think, taken advantage of that. And that's why we see right now, I mean, I'm blown away. It's very local, and so therefore kind of indulgent for me. But Valpo is very typical in that 43% of our residents can't pay their bills. It's astounding.
Can I ask the question more pointedly, which is, if inequality were to disappear tomorrow in America, which isn't going to happen, but let's just say it does, would you have a case for labor?
Yeah, well, I thought that what Ian talked about the idea that workers have a voice, a kind of place at the table, that I find very attractive. This idea of a kind of collaborative opportunity for workers to be sort of to have ownership in a way of the enterprise. I think that's reason. That's not the inequality piece exactly. It's a different kind of inequality, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I think I would feel that I would feel a bit less sharply than I do, because I think in our society where inequality is so pressing, that the need is therefore so great. But I don't want to say that the purpose of unions is limited to kind of their role in mitigating inequality. I think they could have other, very sort of important purposes in lifting up workers' voices and perspectives and dignifying work and whatnot, that goes beyond just the income and wealth gap.
It's interesting because if you look at what data say, what attracts workers to unions, it's often money is fourth.
Yeah.
Typically, it's things like fairness of voice. That's true in Canada. That's also true in the United States. So I wonder if, in trying to make the case for the revival of labor, whether it's not even strategic to say, maybe we should talk about, and I'm not saying we stop talking about inequality, but maybe we should talk about those other things.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I mean, I think in some ways, I almost feel like that's like, that sounds so good to be talking about those, I feel like that's sort of to be talking about shared voice, that sounds wonderful, and so in some ways I feel like maybe you're right that should be foregrounded more, but it feels to me like, 8 steps down the road because of the situation we find ourselves in.
Okay. If you have a question, raise your hand. So I'm going to start taking a list. We've got 2 here. Michael, you're disqualified. Who's at the back? Okay. So we'll start with you, sir, and then it's Anita. Then Anita, and then we'll go to the back. Yeah.
Taking into consideration the wise question that Ed Rudenborg asked about the last short one, I appreciate that a lot. But what really struck me when I was listening to you was that.
We can repeat the
I'll
question.
repeat the question. I'll repeat the question. So thanks. And try and keep it short.
What struck me really significantly was that this sounds an awful lot like, let me call it Lutheran, liberation theology in the United States, which is now a whole lot dissimilar from liberation theology that I was familiar with in Latin America.
Huh.
And that really split the ranks of both Roman Catholics and especially Protestants. I just wonder if you could reflect on that sort of thing, if it's a fair question.
Okay, so just so everyone hears, the question was this: the questioner said this that he detected hints of what sounded like Lutheran liberation theology, which was not all that different from liberation theology in South America, and he wants Heath to reflect on whether that's true or not.
Yeah. I guess I'm not totally sure what to say. I mean, can you give me maybe one more sentence about what you mean by liberation theology? I mean, I know what I think it is, but I want to make sure that we're not talking past each other.
You could say that it would be, what do you want to call it, the preferential option for the poor. I think it's an offshoot and in fact a heresy of Marxism.
Yeah.
And I don't think that it's a heresy of Christianity, but it's accused that way.
Okay.
So it focuses on a lot of the things you said in
Yeah.
the very first part of your lecture.
Yeah, okay, great. I think that so part of what I'm doing in this lecture is recovering what other people believed, right? And lifting up their voices. And I will say that I think a lot of the workers that I'm talking about believed that Jesus was with them in their struggle. And they believed that God was deeply worried about their situation. Someone like Andrew Cameron, who I lifted up and who is a very, I think, interesting character, an evangelical Christian who attended one of the first meetings of Marx's International and hated it, rejected state-centric socialism completely, and would find himself on the opposite side of the labor movement from many of the kind of more radical voices. People like Parsons and Spies are in that kind of international spirit, right? They are much more sort of classically Marxist. So the book and the folks that I've kind of described in a kind of quick and dirty way here, in some sense, to try to get a lot out there, they're all over the map with respect to your question. And I think where they come together is around the idea that that Jesus is carpenter, that God is decisively worried about the plight of the poor, that the New Testament is full of warnings about wealth and exploitation of workers. And then they have all sorts of different ideas about how we should then respond. So probably some of the people I'm talking about would fall under the criticism or the worry that you have. And I think there would be others that would not. And so I think both Cameron and Klein are example of workers who, while very forceful evangelical advocates for labor, are also decisively uninterested in socialism. So, but those debates are old and still ongoing.
Yep. Anita.
What's the role of labor unions in a global economy where businesses can choose to move overseas rather than pay their workers more and live with them?
Yeah. That's a great
So the question, just so the room hears, is what's the role of labor unions in a global economy where capital is fluid and can move across state boundaries?
I mean, I'll give my very brief, and then you should take more of this one, I think. I mean, my brief comment on this is, from what I can tell in the American labor movement these days, is that the focus is a little bit less on manufacturing, which has been very mobile and is, want to go abroad, and more on service workers, more on education, healthcare, the things that aren't going anywhere. And I think that's a kind of pragmatic move on the part of the American labor movement to try to emphasize organizing workers who will be here. But I don't know what you would say.
Yeah, I think just from my own perspective as an operative at CLAC, I think our concern for the health of the labor movement is as global as it is provincial or as local. As I mentioned, the ability to organize workers to speak into broken systems, not just the workplace, has incredible power, redemptive and reformative power. There are on the globe 2 operative organizations, international labor organizations, 2 camps, if you will. CLAC belongs to one of them, of similarly minded, hope-filled organizations that see the problem of inequality and justice and who attack that with courage and fervor, but with the view that work and employer and economic and political systems can operate differently and better as their end pursuit or their ultimate pursuit. So I think their role, I don't know if this gets to your question because I don't know how economic you want it to be, but the role of the trade union globally should be as important and should be as valued by us here as Christians as we do our own movement and our own efforts here.
There was a question at the back. Gentleman at the back.
Thank you so much for setting up the union. I really appreciate that. I know a lot of people who their income is supported by the unions. I was wondering if you could quickly comment on unions that have become almost too powerful and overreaching, like the Ontario Teachers Union or the Canada Post Union, where they have all these strikes to get benefits, but the problem is they have so many strikes that they try and get so many benefits that they actually harm customers and the people they're serving more than the benefits that they actually get.
Yeah. Yeah. Did everyone hear that one? Did everyone hear the question? Okay. Do you want to? Yeah, go ahead.
You go ahead.
Okay.
Okay.
I think the question is sort of what do I think, or what do we think about unions that have amassed so much power that they are, sort of constantly going on strike? Maybe the social detriment outweighs the benefit. If that, does that seem fair? Yeah. I'll again sort of give a brief thought on this, and then, I think this is there are some really interesting differences, I think, in comparing across the border. And I would say that here again, and I was hearing about the postal union over earlier in the day, and I was quite astounded. But I guess what I would just say is in the U.S. context, I haven't encountered very much of it. Now, there are unions that, there are teachers' unions and whatnot that people worry about the ways in which they are impediments to reform of education, for example. There are criticisms. There's lots of criticisms of unions, but unions are, comparatively speaking, relatively powerless in the United States. Not totally powerless, but they are not powerful in many cases. And even in old union cities like Chicago, the unions have been seriously weakened in the last, and often by Democratic leadership. The Democratic Party was long kind of the party of unions in the U.S., but many of the new Democrats are ambivalent at best about unions. In Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, who was Barack Obama's sort of chief of staff early in his administration, has really taken on the unions and seriously weakened them, I think, in that city. Now, they still have some bases of power, but I don't think in this moment, at least in American history and in American labor history, that the worry is too much about unions. I can't think of a time when my life was personally impacted by a strike. We just don't have. We don't have very many strikes, and we don't. And it's partly really, I think, because like I said, less than 7% of private sector workers in the United States are unionized. The public sector, it's higher than that, but in many cases, they're forbidden by law from going on strike. And so, I don't know. I'm not saying that it's not a thing that we should worry about or that could become an issue, or that hasn't been an issue. But at the moment, in the American context, I think that the overweening power of unions is low on my list of concerns.
Ian?
It's a little better here in Canada. The public sector enjoys something like 32%, and much higher, 65%, 70%. The private sector, I think, hovers around 17%. I don't want to comment specifically on Cup W's tactics, or the intransigence of the teachers' union specifically, other than to say, as I did in my response, unions are corruptible institutions, and they can act unwisely, and they can lose sight or track of the real desires and wishes of their members. I think all too often we see unions take a value position, a morally valued position in the public square that I don't think any reasonable person thinks that is representative of their sometimes millions of workers as they take those. And I think that's where CLAC stands in Canada, challenging the labor movement to do better by providing an alternative and a critique of some of the more distasteful practices or unwise decisions. But I wouldn't take away from the ability of that union or any union to have access to that economic tool, the tool to remove its work in as part of the contest that goes on in the workplace. It's not appropriate in all sectors, not appropriate in all instances. We don't want our hospital employees going on strike and abandoning the staff in the ICU, of course, and so we've created alternative structures in those contexts. But leaving the workers with the tools for peaceful disagreement, and a strike is but for sometimes the more outlandish practices or events on the strike line, a strike in and of itself is a peaceful way to resolve disputes. Certainly a more effective way to deal with disputes than was experienced in the Pullman car experience. There's many of the other examples that you talked about tonight where things were violent.
Right.
So a legally sanctioned strike comes with confines and rules and restraints and limits, and it's a much better way today to resolve our differences in the contract negotiations than was true before these mechanisms and these tools existed.
If I may too add a couple of cents to this discussion. The first thing is to note that a lot of the concerns that you have, the teachers, Cup W, are historical monopolies on the capital side as well. So if you look at the teachers' unions in Ontario, which I actually have been affected by, in 1998, there was a massive teacher strike which lasted for 4 weeks. Now, I don't have a negative opinion of that because that meant that I was out of school for 2 weeks. And at the time, it prevented me from having to write my calculus exam. So I personally, I'm very thankful for the teachers for going on strike at that time. I got a great grade in calculus because of that. But the point is, though, that that's a problem, and that's such a huge problem for people because there's a monopoly on the employer side. The public schools have on the employer side, have a disproportionate monopoly on providing education, a state-backed monopoly on providing education to Ontario students. So if you're in favor of, if you want to stick it to them, maybe you should say we should split up the trust, the education trust, right? We should disestablish our public schools, which has been the argument of Charles Glenn in the United States, and that would be an argument that I would hold, that really what you need to do there is actually provide more options. And I would say that's partially what CLAC exists to do as well, to say, look, to the worker, if you are not getting adequate representation from your workplace right now, you have other options. And within the labor movement, you have other options. The choice is not union of one sort and no union. It's a variety of unions that operate from a different perspectives, and you can choose the one that represents your interests best. So that would be thing number one. Thing number two is that I think we need to revisit the moral thinking behind strikes. In Chicago, there was a teacher strike in the 2000, the Chicago's public teacher strike, and people were asking me to comment on it, and I said, look, partially to Ian, we need to do for strikes to some extent what the Christian tradition has done for war. So a strike is a form of economic warfare. It's a peaceful one, thank God. But we should still be, as a Christian tradition, we should be providing the same type of moral thinking behind it to say, okay, on what basis is it legitimate to go on strike? On what basis should we be acting while we're on strike? So that you have this sort of classic Christian thinking about the criteria for striking or for starting a war and the criteria for acting. And I think we should do some hard work on that as well. So those would be my sort of responses to that question. Yes, question right here.
I'm a nurse, and I've been a nurse for many years, and I was part of I'm originally from Manitoba, and we went on strike in 1991 in January, imagine that. And I happened to be pregnant at the time, so I was excused from the front line striking. We went on strike partly because the wages in Manitoba were so far behind. We got a 35% increase in wages over 3.5 years, which brought us close to Ontario and the rest of Canada. It was a very difficult time for nurses, that we are fundamentally in the profession because we care and we don't abandon our patients. But we did have an essential services agreement, so we had to have essential services, which was good. Fast forward, I've been in Ontario for 20-some years. I'm now in management, and I am having these very discussions across the table with, now I use the word carefully, fighting for more staff so that it is a better place for our patients. But thank you so much for all of this information. For me, it's very personal, and I was almost brought to tears when I heard you say what you said, because that is my goal, is working with, as a Christian manager, with union people who don't necessarily have the same philosophy.
Yeah.
Anyway, enough said.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much.
We've got a student right here. Floor goes to the student.
Hi. In the time of the churches not addressing the problems of the union, were there any churches preaching the Jesus is a carpenter message?
That's a great question. She asked, during the kind of historical period that I was talking about, were there any churches that were preaching the gospel of, Jesus, who was a carpenter? And the answer to that is largely no. That there were very few. I mean, it really is kind of remarkable the extent to which across denominational lines up till about the turn of the century, there is a lot of unanimity across kind of the lines of the clergy, including Catholic clergy. We often think about the Catholic Church as being a kind of early pro-labor force. Rerum Novarum, this important labor encyclical, promulgated in 1891. But as I mentioned in the lecture, that really in the American context, people just latched on to the anti-socialism and really downplayed in the early years anything about unions, which was a kind of strong piece of that encyclical. The exception would be the occasional minister. And what I found is really interesting, I thought, was, you have starting in the 1880s and 1890s, these typically young ministers, fresh out of seminary, in their first call, usually in the kind of way that the career path was evolving for ministers in that era. You started in a poor church, and you try to work your way up the ladder to a kind of fancier church where you got the big salary. Many of those men who were called into the ministry and served in those churches, those kind of poor churches at first, were changed by that experience. And they became advocates in many cases for their people. So actually during that Pullman strike that I mentioned, if the Presbyterian minister was, resolutely opposed to the workers, the Methodist minister in Pullman, actually, who didn't have the fancy church building, he rallied to their side. And it was a sort of national news, basically, because it was so unusual for a minister to take the side of labor. But he made the argument entirely out of, if you read, he wrote a book. He wrote the first history of the Pullman strike. His name was Carwardine, William H. Carwardine. And the book is all the stories of the people that he knew. Walter Rauschenbusch, who became a sort of well-known proponent of the social gospel, was converted by his experience working in Hell's Kitchen in New York City. And he talks in his book about all the babies that he buried during his time as pastor in that congregation, and all the sort of intense struggles that the people in his flock faced. And so often I think, this is also true, I think, more broadly in the history of Christianity, that it's when you have those relationships and those kind of face-to-face encounters with people who have a struggle that sometimes you can connect in a way that those sort of fancy churches where people pulled up in their carriages and got out and hobnobbed with all of the other fancy people, it was hard for them to really understand. Jane Addams, actually, after the Pullman strike, wrote an essay about this where she said the whole problem with the labor conflict in our society is that people are existing in echo chambers. This is before social media, but, existing in echo chambers where George Pullman talks to all of his buddies over drinks and hors d'oeuvres in their fancy mansions on Prairie Avenue, and the workers are having their conversations in the Union Hall, and we don't come together and find ways to connect across the difference. So it was the churches and the ministers that were most connected to the problems of the poor that were the earliest to sort of preach that gospel.
I just want to jump in on this, and I have the liberty of not being a historian. I can take a great, I can assume certain things, perhaps. When Kuyper responded in 1891, and Leo XIII responded with the encyclical Rerum Novarum, the effects of industrialization have been waging for 50 years. Children dying in factories, people living in squalid conditions, incredible wealth amassed by those who wielded it over those who had very little. And it took 50 years for them to say, we've missed this. And quite frankly, the anarchists and the socialists are winning the hearts of the people, the minds and the hearts, and they're attending to their needs. It should be the church, it should be the hands and feet of Christ that are responding to these needs. And they both recognize that workers coming together for their mutual gain to participate as effective agents in those economies and those political scenes was good and right. And so to your question, did the church or did pastors speak to this? I think they and perhaps some others unleashed the church, the pastors, unleashed Christian thinkers into that space, properly orienting toward resolving that question in a world that had become very, very broken.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are at our time for tonight. My guess is we could go on for some time, but let's do that over in another venue. I would like to thank Ian Dewart and Dr. Carter, I think, for a wonderful evening. It was thought-provoking. It was great for me to be here. So let's give them a round of applause. So to close our evening out, I'd like to invite Dr. Dieleman to come forward. There she is, to close us out with prayer. Dr. Dieleman, I'll give the microphone to you for the last word.
Shall we pray? Lord, you made us as workers, every one of us. You created us to make, to do, to be active with our minds, with our hands, with our bodies. And you also made us to be in relationship with each other, so that we are not workers completely individually, but we are workers together. From the beginning, you made it so. And we repent, Lord, for all those times in our lives when we have failed to work in ways that honor you or that love our neighbor, in ways that were self-seeking and did not seek justice. We pray that you will help us as individuals, but also as collectives, in our churches, in our organizations, in our communities, to see where there is injustice of any kind, economic or otherwise, and to work together to correct that, so that we might reflect the love of Christ for all of us, for the world that you have made. We pray that you will help us to see injustice, to name it, and to work to rectify it for your sake as well as for each other. We look forward to a day when the banners that we wave will be banners of praise to you. And we ask, Lord, that in the meantime, you will give us conviction to do what is right and good in your sight. Be with us, Lord, now as we leave this place. Be with each person who is traveling. Keep us safe on the roads in wintry conditions. Be with Dr. Carter as he flies back to his home area. Give us all the grace to know that you are above all things, and in you all things hold together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all. Yeah, this is fun. Yeah, thank you.